This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Judy. Now, when we were kids, Judy had this thing for chocolates. Don't get me wrong, I totally support a person's constitutional right to chocolate. But Judy, well, she had this completely gross habit of taking a bite out of each chocolate in the box and spitting out the one she didn't like. Which meant that if Judy ever offered you a chocolate, you'd be getting half-eaten, saliva-coated rejects. Yummy! When the rest of us started dating boys, Judy started too. But she just wanted boys to show up at her door with a box of chocolates, and then she sent the boys home and ate the candy. Sometimes she'd arrange to have 2 or 3 dates an evening. You'd think with so many chocolate zits, she'd have a hard time getting a date. All I can say is thank goodness for pancake makeup. But Judy knew that she couldn't keep it up. She needed to find a permanent sugar daddy, so to speak, and fast. Fortunately, along came Milton Sweet, a sweaty, nervous geek. But he had one redeeming feature. His daddy owned the Sweet Treat Chocolate Company. So, a strategically dropped notebook here, a few bats of the old eyelashes there. Judy had them wrapped around her little finger. And after a few subtle hints, Milton was doing his own wrapping boxes of chocolates to give Judy as presents. Of course, Judy would spit out about 90% of them, but she was still happy. Until one day, Judy found the ultimate chocolate. Now, you'd think finding the ultimate chocolate would have made Judy ecstatic, which it did. Unfortunately, she inhaled the thing in 1.5 seconds, then discovered it was the only one of its kind in the box. The others all had the stupid gooey center she hated. Judy nearly had a conniption. The best chocolate ever, and only one of them in the entire box. She just had to get more. But it didn't matter how many boxes Milton gave Judy. There just weren't enough crunchy-centered chocolates in each box to satisfy her. Finding them soon became an obsession. Eventually, Judy realized the solution had been under her nose all along. All she had to do was fight her way through the mounds of discarded chocolate boxes piled up in her room. Then find Milton and convince him to sneak her into his dad's chocolate factory. There she could have all the crunchy-centered chocolate she wanted. Now, convincing Milton wasn't that hard. If Judy was thinking with her stomach, Milton was thinking with his hormones. He figured a nighttime tour of a spooky automated factory would allow Judy to get closer to her beloved chocolates, while he got closer to Judy. So that night, they sneaked inside the factory. Soon they found conveyor belts for chocolate-covered cherries, nougat, coconut, all spewing out 100 candies a minute, all of which Judy hated. Slowly but surely, they went through seemingly every conveyor belt in the place, coming across every chocolate-covered fruit, nut, or cream on the planet. But still, none of Judy's special crunchy-centered chocolates. Until finally, they came across one last conveyor belt, tucked away in the factory basement. Unlike the others, it was old and slow and nearly falling apart. Judy didn't like the looks of it at all. But in the interest of science, she tried one of the candies. Eureka! It had the crunchy, chewy center she'd been searching for. Without even thinking, she grabbed handfuls and began stuffing her face. But what was the filling? The sign on the filling vat said raspberry cream, but it sure didn't taste creamy or fruity. Overcome by curiosity, Judy decided to take a peek into the vat of filling to see what it was. And then she spit out her chocolate faster than she'd ever done in her life, because inside the vat, gorging themselves on raspberry cream filling and then falling onto the conveyor belt, were hundreds of crawling, squirming insects that had found a sweet place to nest. Her crunchy, chewy centers were cockroaches! Ugh. This is a true story, and it happened to a friend of mine, Judy, who never ate another chocolate again. If I were you, I'd read the list of ingredients on your next box of chocolates very carefully.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. It was cool and rainy the summer that Brother Benedictine joined the monks at St. Ignatius Abbey, located in a remote area miles from what is known as civilization. It had been a long and very tiring trip, but we welcomed the young novice to our humble home with a hearty bowl of gruel and a slab of crusty bread. First stop on his agenda was a meeting with the Holy Father Simon. As the doors of the chamber closed, silent speculation ran rampant. Was Brother Benedictine aware of the requirements of our abbey? Prayer, penance, and a vow of silence? Yes, he was. But because of Brother Benedictine's special status, having spent so many years of his life as part of the outside world, Father Simon granted him a special privilege. Once a year, on the anniversary of his arrival, Brother Benedictine would be permitted to utter 2 words, and 2 words only. The new arrival soon fell into a routine about the abbey with the other monks, harvesting grapes, working in the winery, and transcribing the parchment scrolls. Time passed, and soon it was the first anniversary of Brother Benedictine's entry to our little world. He was called before the assembly of brothers to speak his 2 words. He stood tall before the congregated brethren and thought for a moment. Anticipation hung heavy in the room. Then Brother Benedictine cleared his throat and spoke out proudly. Hard work. The words echoed throughout the great hall. Several of the monks in attendance nodded their heads in agreement. Then we went back to our tasks, each and every one of us with silent concentration. The seasons passed, and soon it was time for Brother Benedictine to once again speak his thoughts. We gathered in the great hall as he took his place before us. A hush fell over the assemblage. Brother Benedictine thought hard for a few minutes, searching for the words to accurately summarize his 2nd year among the brothers of St. Ignatius Monastery. And, as before, 1 year prior, the audience of brothers waited with heightened anticipation. Then Brother Benedictine's face brightened. He had the answer, but his tongue was unused to speaking after almost 2 years of silence. Struggling, he formed the words, "Lousy food." Again, several of the monks in attendance nodded their heads in agreement. Then we went back to our assigned tasks. Alas, the seasons passed as they always do. A time to reap, a time to sow, a time to harvest, and of course, a time for study and prayer. Brother Benedictine spent a great deal of time in his cell, diligently studying and engaged in other scholarly pursuits. As spring and the 3rd anniversary of his joining the abbey approached, there was a festive air around the monastery. What insights would this now mature monk share with us? Brothers from distant abbeys who'd learned of the young monk's annual ritual made great pilgrimages to join us on this most special of days. Finally, Brother Benedictine, led by Father Simon, took his position before the hushed masses. He paused in thought for a time, contemplating the universe and our place in it. Glances of anticipation were exchanged, each brother on the edge of his bench, not wanting to miss any of the 2 words Brother Benedictine was about to utter. Finally, a ray of sunlight shone through the window, and once again, divine inspiration touched his brow. His countenance brightened. He looked up, his eyes sparkling, and he spoke words of such insight, such feeling, that to a man we were touched as we never had been before. Brother Benedictine spoke the 2 words that summarized life in the monastery as no words had ever done. He said, "Lumpy beds." The assembled throng broke out in tumultuous applause. Brother Benedictine bowed his head modestly. Then he held out his hands to hush the crowd. He'd something else to say, but this was unheard of. He was only permitted to speak 2 words once a year. What could a monk endlessly devoted to the work of this order possibly have to say? What would make him break his vow of silence? I quit. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And many years later, when Father Simon was asked about the mystery of Brother Benedictine, the good father replied, "Good riddance. All he ever did was complain."
This is a true story. It happened to a friend actually a neighbor of mine. Nobody can say that Patty Pringle isn't a good neighbor. And what people do in the privacy of their own backyards is their own affair. Like I said, I don't meddle. So when I saw that my next door neighbors, the Taylors, were planning a big barbecue, I said, fine. I hope they get good weather for it, even if I'm not invited. But when I happened to peek out my upstairs window that overlooks their backyard, you know, the one you have to stand on the chair to see out of, I saw that Mrs. Taylor was going to be serving salmon, a whole grilled salmon. And at $12 a pound, who's she trying to impress? And it certainly wasn't my business when I saw their cat, Muffy, jump up on the picnic table and start to nibble on the salmon. Luckily, Mrs. Taylor came outside and caught that stupid cat in the act. Anyway, by the time I came downstairs onto my patio, I could hear Mrs. Taylor having a hissy fit. Look what that stupid cat's done! My dinner's ruined! Well, the first thing she did is grab the cat and hand it over to her precious little Emerson. Now, Emerson's going on about how the cat has eaten the eyes out of the salmon and how the cat's chewed up half the salmon's face. And would you believe Mrs. Taylor, just as cool as a cucumber, told Emerson not to say a word to anybody at the party? Mrs. Taylor told him that she'll fix the salmon by decorating it with parsley. Imagine disguising a chewed-up salmon with parsley. Mrs. Taylor and Emerson shook hands and zipped their lips on their little secret. I had to go for an hour around 5, you know, when the grocery store marched down the baked goods. When I came back, the Taylor's party was in full swing. Cars parked everywhere, an awful mess. How was I even supposed to get into my own driveway? Well, as long as they were having a good time, what did it matter? Everybody, and there must have been 20 very loud people there, as if one extra person me would have made a big difference. They were just raving about the dinner. Great salmon. Oh, this fish is amazing, Jenny. You must give me the recipe. I've never had fish this tasty. Well, they've never had my stewed catfish, that's for sure. And there was Mrs. Taylor, just soaking in the compliments, when Emerson came running up to her. Mom, I've got to tell you something. Well, Mrs. Taylor tried to shoo him away, but he kept tugging at her arm. Finally, he just blurted it out. Mom, Muffy ate the fish and now she's dead. Well, you should have seen Mrs. Taylor's face. I'll tell you one thing, her underwear and fine delicates never come out that white on the wash line. Now everyone started screaming about poison salmon. Well, the shrieks and cries from that backyard, people retching and rushing to the hospital to get their stomachs. Not what I would call a very successful dinner party. The next day, I happened to see Mrs. Taylor and Emerson in the backyard. I popped my head over the fence and asked how things had gone the night before. A disaster. Everybody hurling and spewing, said rude little Emerson. Their friends won't even speak to them now, said Mrs. Taylor. And if that's not enough, the cat is dead. Oh, by the way, I said, about Muffy. Last night driving back from the market, I ran over your cat. I didn't want to disturb your big fancy party, so I just left the poor little thing on your porch. Nobody can say that Patty Pringle isn't a good neighbor. This is a true story. It happened to a neighbor of mine, which is probably why the Taylors don't serve fish for dinner anymore.